We are honored to introduce you guys to the esteemed Tom O'Brien.
Hey everybody.
We're so grateful to have him here today, so thank you on behalf of our class and our BC community.
Thanks Ellie, thanks Edwin. Hey everybody.
I guess to just get the ball rolling, I'd like to ask you how you began your career in real estate and where it all started.
Sure. I grew up here in Greater Boston. I went to Brown. I played football for Brown. This is a long time ago, you guys. I'm now 60 years old, so it was a long time ago, but I loved it. It was really fun. And when we graduated, I wasn't really quite sure what I wanted to do. I interviewed with a bunch of different companies, and I got a job with AIG. For many of you, that may not be a name you know, but at that time, it was a really big financial services and insurance company based in New York, and they had a training program in which I would learn a little bit about finance and real estate and things like that. And so I took that job. I moved there with a bunch of other guys who I knew, and we lived, we had, I think, 4 guys in a 2-bedroom apartment. This is probably familiar to a lot of you folks. And I lived in New York for a couple years. I then came back to Boston. I quit my job because there was a presidential campaign. A guy named Mike Dukakis, who was the governor from Massachusetts, was running for president. And I decided I really wanted to do something different. I wanted to be involved in government and politics in cities. I loved that kind of work. And so I quit my job and went to work for him, traveled around the country in different places, worked on a presidential campaign, which was exciting. We lost. This was 1988. But I learned a lot. And so when I came back to Massachusetts, I decided that I really wanted to be in finance, real estate, cities, kind of have a hand in what made cities tick. I went to law school at night. I went to Suffolk Law at night and worked at a place called the Massachusetts Industrial Finance Agency, which is a kind of a state-sponsored agency that helped to create jobs and new housing and helped nonprofits build new projects. And then along the way, after I finished my law degree, I met a guy named Tom Menino, who was then a city councilor who became the mayor. He was one of the longest serving mayors in the history of Boston. He was the mayor here for 20 years. And I went in to work for him. I was 29 years old in 1993. My wife and I had just gotten married, and I became what's called the chief of staff for the Boston Redevelopment Authority, which is the planning and development agency for the city of Boston. I did that job for a few years, and then he promoted me to the top job in that agency, which is the director. So I did that job then for a number of other years. I loved it. We did interesting things around planning for the new seaport. We did a lot of work around new projects. One of the first projects I worked on was the then expansion. Some of us in the back will remember if you had a big football game at Boston College, you had to play at what was then called Schaefer Stadium, which is now Foxborough. The stadium here on the campus was too small. And so we worked on the expansion and the rehab of that stadium, which we did in the mid-90s. So I just get to work on a bunch of different projects. After I left there, then I went to work for a company called Tishman Speyer, which is a large New York-based company. From there, I kind of got it in my head that I wanted to do this for myself. I had one start with a company called JPI that wanted to kind of sell its platform to a group of new folks who would take over their platform, and I was going to be that person for them in the Northeast. I had 2 partners who were really great folks, and we formed this company. It's called the HYM Investment Group in the fall of 2009, and we began basically focusing on larger projects that had been sort of broken apart in the previous recession. As things go through a recession, assets reprice downward, and it created an opportunity for us to grab some of these things together with investors. And so we've basically been doing that work for 15 years here in Greater Boston, which is my home.
That's incredible.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the response. So you talked about, you working in the Boston Redevelopment Authority. So I kind of want to dig deep into that. So what do you think was kind of like the biggest challenge while, overseeing the development of over kind of like 12 million square feet of projects during your time there?
So for many of you who are coming out of school in the next couple of years, working in government allows you, A, to serve others, but B, to learn a lot. You can be right in the middle of the action, depending on where you are and who you're working for, and it's really interesting and fun, and you learn a lot. So that's kind of the beauty for me. I did that, as I said, in my late 20s and early 30s, early to mid 30s. I'd say, in answer to your question, Edwin, the hardest part for me was I was a young person in a position that was, that had a big spotlight. And so what I learned was to maintain a really strong relationship with the ultimate person in a city who has the largest spotlight, who is the mayor, and stay in good shape with that mayor. Be sure that you're a really good communicator and clearly signaling what your agenda is and what it is you're trying to get completed. And just kind of be smart about that, preserving your relationships. One of the things we should talk about today is just what relationships mean and how to build relationships in all aspects of your life and certainly in your business. That was a big part of what I learned at that point in City Hall in Boston at that time in my life.
It's wonderful. And I guess following up to that question a bit, what prompted you to move from the public service to the private services at Tishman Speyer and JPI as well?
So I loved the work I did in government, and it was really fun, but it's stressful and tiring and very demanding. This is going to be counter to what I just said to you, but please accept this. It doesn't pay as well as the private sector. At that point in our lives, my wife and I had 3 children. The kids were all young. I think our oldest was 4, so I think we were like 4, 3, and 2 maybe were the kids. And so the idea of being in a position where I could start to earn a little bit more money was attractive to me. But I would say it was also important for me to kind of find a place that shared my values, that cared a lot about cities, that cared about trying to do the right thing, and to be in a position where you could work on really interesting large projects. And I found that with Tishman Speyer. People may not know this, but not too far from this campus, Harvard University, I hope that's okay if I can say that, the name of that institution in this place, but the Harvard, over a span of probably 30 years or more, purchased a bunch of acreage in Alston, not too far from here. And so those huge projects that are underway, there's probably 3 or 4 cranes in the air. You can see them probably, I would bet, from some parts of this campus. That's Tishman Speyer building that out. So they're building, I think the first project has like 600 or 800 units of housing, about 500 to 700,000 square feet of life science space, a hotel, conference center, all those things. So they really knew how to do it and do it well. So I learned a lot from them. It was fun for me.
That's incredible. Thank you.
So earlier in the conversation, you mentioned that it is kind of like encourage the class to step into kind of like work in the government while we're young. So how has working in the government, along with your background in history and law, influenced your approach to real estate development?
So I would say there were 2 big things for me. One is to learn how to be in a stressful situation and still think clearly and be a positive leader for your team. That's kind of a really important thing. So if you're in government and you're in the kind of the center of the action, you put into action many of the lessons that I would presume many of you have learned your entire lives. The lessons you may have learned from your parents or other older people who impacted your life around just being a good person, being smart about how you share information, being smart about how you think about people, being an empathetic leader, and trying to understand where people are coming from and maybe kind of walk in their shoes a little bit if you can. That you learn a lot of that if you're in a early leadership position in government, I think. And so I would really recommend that. I'd say the other piece for me at that time was there was a lot that didn't go well for me. So while I had successes and some really great days, there were some really hard days. And I would say something similar. Some of you may have heard of a company called NVIDIA, which is a huge chip manufacturer that is now right in the heart of the AI business. And the leader of NVIDIA is a really interesting entrepreneur who's led that company for probably 30 years. And he had some really tough days. And his mantra these days is, particularly for people your age, is sort of, I wish you difficult days earlier in your career, because learning to overcome difficulty is sort of one of the most important things in life. And so for me, for good or for bad, I learned a lot of that in those days. And so to me, those were really important pieces of how I was able to progress.
That's Wonderful. I guess this is kind of jumping a bit, but going off of having hard days and learning from those experiences, can you tell us a bit about any problems and how you navigated those problems at your current project at Suffolk Downs?
Sure, tons of problems. So Suffolk Downs, if I could, Ellie, can I just read?
Yes, please, please.
So Suffolk Downs is a horse racing track that for 80 years or so was a horse racing track in Greater Boston. It's located about 2/3 of it is in Boston, in the community of East Boston, which is where the airport is, and the remaining third is in Revere, which is right next door. So horse racing, again, when I was younger, horse racing was kind of a big deal. It isn't the same. It doesn't have the same focus that it once did, and so horse racing at this particular track really went downhill, and so it offered us an opportunity to buy this horse racing track. So the chance to buy 162 acres in Boston directly on the MBTA, directly linked to the Blue Line, so that, for example, if you were to get on the Blue Line, the line that runs right next to our site, in 10 minutes you'd be in downtown Boston. So to us it seemed perfect that 162 acres would become available. The challenge is we had to permit the 162 acres. So to do that, my partner and I have one of my partners, we do a lot of this work together, and he and I have been working together now for probably almost 20 years, I think 18 or 19 years. We did over 450 different public meetings, so meetings in rooms like this, some large groups, some smaller groups, some small meeting formats with, having a cup of coffee with people, but we did over 450 of those to get that site permitted, which is a big challenge, a lot of work. So that's, first problem is take this big site and put it into a position where you can actually obtain value from it, the value that investors trusted you with when we first bought the site. It took us 3 years to do that, and we were able to get that done. And now the big challenge for us is we've permitted that 162 acres. We permitted it, just to kind of give you a sense of this, for a total of 16 million square feet, a mix of residential and commercial and retail. So basically we're going to build a community there. When we're done, we'll build a place where about 15,000 people will live and about 20,000 people will come to work every day. So it's kind of like the size of a mid-sized Massachusetts town, or a good-sized Massachusetts town. To do that, we have to now put ourselves in a position where we raise another $8 to $9 billion of capital to go vertical with all those buildings. There's probably 54 buildings across the site. So it's a different set of challenges. Do we have the right organization with the right people who can execute on those buildings? We need, really good project managers. Do we have the right relationships with the right architects and finance people who help us raise that capital? Are we aligned correctly so that we can think through ideas around the retail that make it an attractive place for folks like you guys to want to live? We have a music venue, we have all those sorts of things. So there's challenges all the time. It's really fun to work on it. There are days that are frustrating and hard, but it's really fun to work on it. I get to go to work every day with a really great team of people, so it's fun.
That's incredible.
And it's a smaller team than you think. For all that work that we're doing, we grew before. Their real estate's sort of in a recession today, just so you know, in the last year or so. Our team got to be almost 50 people. We built our team intentionally to match up with the diversity of the city of Boston. So probably over 50% of our team was made up of people of color. A total combination between there and people of color and women, around 65% of our team. We had to, as we finished different projects and we're not able to start new projects in the last year, some of the people left our firm, so we're probably down now around 30 to 35 people, but same metrics. So 50% women and people of color, and it's really, as I said, it's really fun to go to work every day with a great team of folks.
Yeah.
Sorry, Henry.
It's all right. So speaking of Suffolk Downs, I read online that there was around like 9 to 10% of affordable housing in that area. So in your opinion, how important do you think it is to include portions of affordable housing in large development like Suffolk Downs?
So housing generally is a really complicated topic for all of us in the United States. So the challenge is we've kind of gone through, over the course of the last, call it 50 to 75 years, long cycles of making different decisions around how we're going to build housing. And for those of you who, one thing I would recommend to you is really read carefully about the aspirations and the goals originally of the Great Society under Lyndon Johnson, which is just really fascinating. You know, at the peak of, as he was trying to envision that and implement that in 1965, call it, it really was something that was just fascinating. They created originally the Housing and Urban Development Department at the federal government, which hadn't existed before. Unfortunately, all of that work, all of that hope was overtaken by the government's involvement in the Vietnam War. But it's a really fascinating thing to read about. And then when we got to the early 1980s, with the election of Ronald Reagan, the decision was made to for the federal government to get out of the business of creating affordable housing. So basically, since the early 1980s, where our federal government has been is sort of maintaining the stock of affordable units that exist. There are some affordable units that are created in larger numbers using tax credits. So a company that makes money, you know, a company that's not in the real estate business, Amazon, okay, when Amazon makes money to offset some of their tax liability, they invest in tax credits for the creation of new affordable housing units. So that's one way that new units are created. The only other way that affordable units are created is to pair them with private developments like us. And that really only works in markets like Boston that are high-end markets where the values are big. Like this concept of pairing them with private projects doesn't work in, forgive me folks if you're from here, but it doesn't work as well in Kansas City or other places like that, but it works well in markets like Boston, Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, those big city markets. So for us, it is important, really important, to create affordable housing, and it's part of our agreement with government. So in exchange for the permits that we get to build 16,000 units of housing, we typically have an obligation to take a percentage of those and make them affordable for people who earn a certain percentage of what's called the area median income. So the AMI, area median income, for example, this is going to sound odd to you, but for, let's say, a family of four around here within 2 miles of this room that we're sitting in, for a family of four, the area median income is probably $100,000 approximately. So we probably produce units that are in the 80% to 85% range for people who order that, and you can think through the math of what people could pay to make that work. So that's part of our obligation to do that. Really important to make that work. The challenge on the flip side of that is if we over agree to that, then we can't build any units at all. So in other words, if the government wants us to build 10% of our units affordable, we might be able to make that work. But if the government pushes us to say, okay, let's make it 20%, well, 20% times 0 is 0 because we can't build the buildings at that number. So it's trying to find that balance to make it work. I would just close this out by just saying, I'm sorry to go around the moon, but I say all that to say just this issue is huge for our country. We have to find a national path to begin to address this housing and to build a housing crisis and build housing on a more broad-based basis, while at the same time still pushing private folks like ourselves to produce as much as we can. So it's a combination of both.
This may have just answered that question a bit, but going off of that, looking at the future for affordable housing, especially in Boston, what innovations do you think or changes that need to be made that you believe are necessary for the growing demand of affordable housing?
If I had to pick one thing, I would say one thing that we have struggled to kind of figure out is there a way to manufacture housing on a broader scale? So by that, so when you drive by and look at a building as it gets built, it may not look like much to you as it's getting built, but when you've watched these things get built or been part of these things as they get built over and over again, the strange part for me is every time we take on a new project, so when we take on one 250 unit project, we start from zero. Even though we just completed 20 of these, we start from zero. New architects, what's our program going to be? What kind of unit mix do we want? All those different things. If we were able to get to kind of a manufactured housing space, maybe we could build more housing faster, cheaper. There's a bunch of countervailing forces to that. there are building trades people who care deeply about how we build them, and we care deeply about the building trades people and how people are employed and paid. So we care about the building trades, but at the same time, we have to find a way to get to the point where we can build housing on a more efficient basis. Just to give you a sense of things, a single unit in a downtown high-rise building built today in Boston costs over $1 million per unit. So think about what that means both for the market and the affordable market. A single unit, if I had a site, right outside this building in which I could build 200 units here in a different manner, so I would call it, in that instance, I would call it a mid-rise building. So let's say this is an 8-story building. So there we could use a different structure, different design, which is less expensive. That's still going to cost probably $700,000, $650,000 to $700,000 per unit. So we're at a point where it's so expensive to build these units, it's hard to figure out how to provide affordable housing. That's the challenge.
All right. So I want to go back to kind of like the Suffolk Downs development. So earlier you said that it is important to kind of like maintain connections, like built upon relationship. So how does this idea, how would you implement this idea in kind of like these different projects of yours?
So I think that the one thing that helped us a lot at Suffolk Downs is we were at a point in our careers where we had already done this work. So in terms of relationship building, we had already taken on a former railroad site, which was then called NorthPoint in Cambridge. It's now called Bulfinch Crossing. We had already taken on a downtown project where we were redeveloping the site of a garage. Many of you may know the New Balance campus, where the Bruins practice facility is and the Celtics practice facility is. We had done that. So we had a certain credibility, and more importantly, Edwin, we had a set of relationships. The elected officials from the mayor on down to state representatives and state senators, they knew who we were, and we knew who they are, and we had relationships with them. So there's a certain amount of trust. People recognize us, they recognize our work, and they trust the work that we do. So the one thing I would say to you, particularly, and I do this with my own kids, I have a group of kids who are in their teens to 20s. I'm always, make sure you carefully, when you meet somebody, carefully try to get to know them a little bit. When they give you their contact information, establish a system of keeping contacts right away. I use, in business we use, you guys probably use Apple. In business it's mostly Microsoft. So my Microsoft contacts, I'm like a nerd about how I keep my contacts and how I maintain all that, so that I can search up again to say, hey, a year ago, I met this person, where did I meet them, can I search that up again? So just think carefully about those relationships in your life and how you maintain contact with people. Thank you notes or thank you emails or thank you texts, all those things, really important. You never know when a relationship that you build today is going to matter at some point in your future. So everything matters.
Yeah, and going back a bit, I want to talk about more of HYM. So what led you to the creation of HYM, and what is your vision for the future in terms of Boston neighborhoods? I know you talked a bit about this in Suffolk Downs, but for the future.
So the one thing, and you guys forgive me if this is too much information, but the one thing about our business, which is interesting, is the piece that makes our business go, if you can imagine, is capital, right? So I just said we need to raise $8 or $9 billion for these buildings. There's no way the O'Brien family does not have $8 or $9 billion. So where do we go to raise it? Well, you have to raise it mostly from what we call institutional investors. So these are life insurance companies, pension funds, those folks. If you look at when those pension funds do a year-end roundup and you look at their sort of summary page, they typically have a page that says X% is in equities or stocks, X% is in bonds, and then a small percent is in real estate. And then within real estate, they typically say, okay, there's a mix of, I can buy an existing office building, not today, but an existing office building filled with tenants that has cash flow and it's stable, or I can pair up with a developer. It's more risky, but my returns might be better. So for us, the key to our business is to find our path to those institutional investors, the large pension funds. The largest real estate investor in the world, as an example, is the California State Employees Pension Fund, CalSTRS it's called. It's a huge pension fund, and they're a big investor, and so being on their screen and able to do work with them is really important to do. So coming back to your question, what we thought for HYM, when the recession hit in 2008, and you guys were like were you in elementary school? You weren't even in elementary school yet, right? So in 2008, were you in nursery school, wherever you were? So you have no memory of that, right? So 2008, ask your mom and dad, was a terrible, terrible recession. It was really, really bad. And what ended up happening was there were a number of large national players in our business that had raised capital from those institutional investors, and as the world went bad, they lost a ton of money, billions and billions and billions of dollars. So we said to ourselves, okay, when the market comes back, we want to be the company that is on the ground in Boston. Boston's a place where those institutional investors want to be because strong economy, a lot of great educational institutions, hospitals, great companies, all those things. But we want to be the local people who know this market better than anybody else. And we want them to trust us that we can complete and get done these large institutional grade projects, as opposed to them reinvesting with those same national companies. And it largely played out that way. That was kind of our path. And so we've built a company that competes with those large national folks kind of from nothing, which is fun to do.
Just another side question, where did HYM, the name, come from?
So HYM, so my wife and I have 5 children. All our kids are adopted. They're all born outside the US. So my oldest son is from Bogota, Colombia, 2 girls from Guatemala, a son from Ecuador, and a daughter from Ethiopia. Our 4th child, one of our kids from Guatemala, was diagnosed at the age of 3. She was a perfectly healthy kid until the age of 3. But at the age of 3, she was diagnosed with something called leukodystrophy, which is a brain disorder that caused her to lose a variety of bodily functions. She had terrible seizures, and she died at the age of 8 in 2008. And as she became sick and her words would become jumbled, she would look at me and she would say, "Hold you me, daddies," hold you me. So when we formed this company, my wife looked at me and said, you should make this personal. So I looked at my partners. I said, can we name it the HYM Investment Group, which stands for Hold You Me, this little girl who's been this amazing guide for us. And so that's who we are. So for me, it's kind of fun because I'll go to these different real estate events where they'll do an update on the Boston market and they'll put on the screen, HYM is doing this project or HYM is doing that project. And I sort of smile a little bit and say, well, that just stands for this little girl. So it's pretty awesome. So thank you for asking that question.
Thank you for sharing. That's
Thanks.
beautiful.
Thank you. I did that without crying, which is not easy to do. So thank you. All good. I did that one time. We were competing for this project, and we were in front of the board of trustees of this university, which is not too far from here. And at the end of it, everything had gone really well. And the president asked me that same question. And as I answered the question, I began to sob in front of the board of trustees. And so I looked at them and I said, well, now you got to give us a deal. So anyway, sorry.
Thank you.
So speaking about kind of like the real estate industry in general, there was this this article from kind of like Suffolk Law School, and then in it says, you're a bridge builder in a field known for being very competitive and cutthroat, where victories are often earned by some measure of force. So could you kind of give like the class kind of an insight about how the real estate industry works behind the scenes and how you are able to kind of like stick to your morals and being a bridge builder instead of a bulldozer?
Man, you guys did a lot of research on this. This is like unsettling, right? So I'm a very competitive person, and I hate to lose. That the Harvard transaction that I described for you, that Tishman Speyer is doing not too far from here, the large buildings with the cranes in the sky, we competed for that. And so one aspect of me is proud that we went up against this huge international company, Tishman Speyer, and it was us, in the end, we were the final 2. So they had narrowed down the competition to just the 2 of us. So it was us versus them, but we lost. And I was pissed, quite frankly, that we lost. But at the same time, we did a great job. We had a great team of people. And so, we live to fight another day and we go off and go find something else. So I think being a competitive person is totally called for. and warranted, and you got to be competitive, I think. I am somebody who believes that participation trophies are not great, for our next generation of kids. I think it's okay to say one person won and one person lost. So I'm totally fine with the competition. I think, Edwin, the point of that though is, but we're also friends and empathetic with other people. So, particularly in Boston, this is kind of a small town. And so I know all the people that we compete against. And I'm not, I wouldn't say I'm best pals with everybody just because people have different personalities and we don't always match up. But I know pretty much what their lives are all about. I know their families, I know what they're all about, I know who they are. And you try and be a good person. And at the same time, I would say too, you need to be really smart about the communities in which we work. And so one thing I do care deeply about is Boston. I worry a lot about, this doesn't have anything to do with real estate, but I worry about the Boston Public Schools. I mean, the Boston Public Schools are now 48,000 kids, which is not a big school system compared to other big cities. There's a lot we could and should be doing to improve the outcome for Boston Public School kids. And so I think, I try to be involved in issues like that and try and bring other business people into those issues, because what happens in our community outside of our specific projects really matters. And so just try and do that by example is a key part of who we are.
That's beautiful. And I guess kind of bouncing off of that, how do you see Boston's real estate market evolving over the next decade? And what role do you want HYM, to play in it?
So, I mean, I would say the easiest way to answer that is to say where we've been has amazed me. I think some of you, particularly from the Boston area, may remember that as recently as 2015, as an example, if you were to walk to what's called the Seaport District now in Boston, there really was not much there. There was really open air parking lots and not much else. That is just a short time ago. I know that seems like a long time ago for you guys, in your age group, but it was less than 10 years ago. There basically was nothing there. So in the span of 9 years, that has become a huge cluster of life science companies in which there's a ton of science that's being worked on, completed, and sort of creating value for companies. A huge place for people to live. I walked through there last night, a dinner that I had to go to, and I walked back through there. There's a ton of, there's a lot of discussion around, is it a place that is diverse enough? It's not a place where it's not diverse enough in terms of people who live there. But the people who walk through there and go to restaurants and shop and all that, very diverse. So where we've been is amazing to me. So where we're going to go the next 10 years, I don't know, but I've been really, unbelievably pleasant surprised and really just fortunate to be able to work in the city. So I'm a big believer in the future of Boston. If we set the path right, if we make the right decisions about trying to help institutions like Boston College do well and attract people like you. There were probably 50% of this audience were people, I would say 40% of this audience was outside of this country, and maybe another, close to 40% were people outside of the Northeast, right? So maybe I didn't get that exactly right, but there was a lot of people from all over. Our goal as people in Boston who care about the city is to convince you to stay here, to build a business here, to build a life here. We would love that. That would be great. So that's the beauty of Boston.
Thank you. I guess another question that I have. What advice would you give to someone entering the real estate development field today?
So I'd say the most important thing I would say if you're entering this field today is align yourself with a really good leadership team. And I say this a lot to young people. When you're coming out of school, many of you were like me. I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do, but I had a sense of kind of where I wanted to go. And so, unless you wake up every day and say, I know I want to be an environmental engineer and work on the following things, you're probably like most of the rest of us, which is, I'm not really sure exactly what I want to do. So what I would say is, the most important thing is to really be aware of the people you're going to work with, the leaders who you're going to be working with, to link up with a great group that will teach you a lot, the group that shares your values, people who will help you grow. And then don't be afraid to take chances. I said earlier, I quit my job and totally went off on something different. My car almost got repossessed. I I lost a lot. It was crazy, but it was one of the best year and a half of my life. So don't be afraid to take risks, and remember to keep track of the relationships that you're building along the way. That's a key thing.
Thank you.
So kind of like one of the last questions I have, and then to open up the floor for more questions,
Sure.
is, looking back at your career, what do you hope kind of like your lasting impact on Boston and its kind of real estate landscape will be?
So I hope that what we've done is we've created, through built buildings, what we call the built environment, we've created places where people actually can kind of see their lives improved. One project I worked on at the Boston Redevelopment Authority in the 90s was there at that time in the mid 90s. This may seem like a long time ago for you guys, but at that time there were basically no new grocery stores in most of the neighborhoods in Boston, in particularly the neighborhoods of Roxbury, Dorchester, Hyde Park, and even Allston, to be honest with you. So, but as Boston began to grow in the 90s, many of the larger supermarket companies like Star Markets, Stop and Shop, and others wanted suddenly to be in parts of Boston, but they didn't always want to be in all parts of Boston. And so we basically, I went to folks at Stop and Shop and said, okay, well, if you want to be in Brighton, we need you to be in Grove Hall in Roxbury as well. And so we did a 25,000 square foot grocery store in Grove Hall that was completed in 1999, still stands, still operates, and that made a huge impact on people in their lives in that neighborhood. So working on things like that, they seem small, but they're really impactful on people's lives. So I love that. And if you like that work and love working with people, I invite you to be part of this business.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for answering our questions
Yeah.
and everything that you're doing for Boston and
Thank
our
you.
community. We'd like to open the floor up to the rest of the students if anyone has questions.
Thank you for being here today. Austin Ginocchio, I'm a senior in the MCAS. Big fan of the O'Brien family on campus, obviously.
How about that?
So
Yeah.
it's really awesome to have you here.
Pretty good victory. I'd say.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic.
We were all here in the rain. It was great watching you guys, by the way. It was so much fun, and Billy's so excited to be here with all you guys.
Absolutely. We're doing it
He
for
had
the right
90
reasons.
He had 90 recruits on the sideline on Saturday, which was
It's a
awesome.
great game, absolutely, to be there for. So when you're talking about these, like the Suffolk Downs, 16 million square feet, something like that is like a monstrosity in my head. Like I can't even conceptualize how large that is, and especially with like the amount of steps and the complexity of the development going on within it. So like when you first get an idea of a huge project like that, where do you even begin? Like how do you time manage? How do you break that down in your head and like even begin to start to chip away at it?
So we had, for us, so I do a lot of this work in conjunction with 3 partners that I have, and in particular one partner, and he and I are really good complementary personalities. So I do a lot of these sorts of things. He's a really great, serious, steady, kind of almost like an engineering personality. And so the two of us are really good with one another. So on Suffolk Downs, at the time I knew the guy who was the lead owner, or represented the ownership group at Suffolk Downs. I had heard that he was ready to sell, and he was actually about to put a deal together with somebody else. Talk about competitive. So I jumped in the car and we went to see him, and I had this relationship. He actually had lost a child in his life, so we shared this terrible life experience. So he looked at us and he said, well, Tommy, I'd do this deal with you. You just got to, bid more than what I already have in hand for an offer. And I said, well, how much is the offer? He said, $150 million. And I said, how about $155 million? He said, yeah, done. So we shook hands. Now I had no idea how I was going to raise the rest of that money, right? So, and of course my partner, his name is Doug Mance, who's the most awesome guy. He was basically throwing up on his shoes, like under the table. So we walk out, and he was like, how are we going to do this? And we did have the makings of an idea because of other projects that we've done of where we were going to go to raise the capital. So we sort of knew what we were going to do, but it was a risk. And then we had to say to ourselves, okay, how big do we think we can make this? And we sort of just backed into the 16 million square feet. And then one day, this is like just a week into our due diligence and all of our effort, I just needed a break. So I just walked up, our offices were in downtown Boston. I got on the blue line, and I just was kind of meandering, thinking, well, I'll just take the blue line out to Suffolk Downs. And I'm surprised I hadn't done this yet, but I was kind of on the train, I'm looking down at my phone, then I look up, and I'm at the Suffolk Downs station, and I looked at my watch, and it was like 10 minutes. And I came home, and I'm like, Doc, we have to do this. Like, I have no idea how we're gonna do this. I don't know how we're gonna make this work. But look at this real estate on the blue line, right? We gotta make this work. So sometimes it's just that, you know?
Yeah.
And we had this great team of people, great group of folks, and we were able to underwrite it. It's a whole longer answer about how we underwrite things and how we think it through. I mean, we have to build all the infrastructure. So there's, you know, you think about it's a horse racing track. There's no water, there's no sewer, so we have to build all of that. So figuring that cost, estimating that cost based upon what we've done in the past, what's it gonna cost to build the buildings? What do we think the revenue is gonna be? How do we structure the land value? How do we think through the capital piece? I mean, it was complicated, but we have a great team and really fun. And sometimes you just have to be a leader that says, we'll figure this out, you know, so it's fun.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
My question was more on your start with HYM. How do you build credibility right from the get-go? You talk a lot about relationships and how keeping that throughout your life has been very impactful. I wonder if that is kind of how you would argue you built credibility from the beginning.
It probably is. I mean, I think that got me in the door when we started HYM. So I think there was a different credibility gap for us at that time because we had not, as our own company, built buildings ourselves. So in other words, people knew me as the director of the BRA. They knew me as a person who could, you know, kind of lead an organization. They knew me as a person who could, you know, implement plans for projects and things like that. But they'd always seen me working for some other larger organization, the city of Boston or, you know, Tishman Speyer. So to suddenly see me in the role of our company, all of this, so we had to prove ourselves. So that was a different site that we haven't talked about. But the first building we built was in Cambridge on a former rail yard. It was then called NorthPoint. It's now called Bulfinch Crossing. But the way the structure of the financing was, it was actually CalSTRS, that California pension fund. So we were in the five-year closed-end fund with them. So we had to sell it in a 5-year period. But all that plan was everything that we started, that we did. The first buildings were buildings that we built. And once we completed those buildings, then suddenly we could check off that box and people could say, yeah, these guys can do this. That was a huge, huge change for us. So sometimes you sort of have to say, yeah, I can do it. You figure out how to do it, surround yourself with great people, and then once you've done it, then you gotta say to the world, look at what we did, you know. So step by step, with an ounce of humility, I guess, is the other piece of it. So thank you.
So given the nature and complexity of the development, are these funds structured in like closed-end funds? And if so, do you have an open-ended fund? And like how much do you typically lever when you go to do these projects?
It's a good question. So it's a mix, really, in our business. So at the time, and it kind of moves with cycles. So at the time for us, when we bought that site in Cambridge called NorthPoint, we bought it with a fund that was with a company called Canyon Johnson. So Magic Johnson formed this partnership with Canyon, which is a huge hedge fund, you know, huge private equity fund based in Los Angeles. And they had a real estate piece to them, and they had raised this money from CalSTRS. But the way CalSTRS kind of kept them on a tight leash was to say, it's a 5-year closed-end fund, so you can invest at the beginning of the cycle, but then you got to replenish those funds back to us at the end of 5 years. So just a quick sense of the numbers on that. So when we bought that site, we probably bought it at a price of about $10 per square foot on a kind of a land basis. We sold it at $65 a foot. So it was 6 times the initial investment, which seemed great at the time, and it was a huge transaction for everybody, for Canyon Johnson. Today, though, if we'd held on to it, that site is probably worth $600 a foot. So it would have been a huge win for everybody if we could have held on to it. But we didn't, because we were in that closed-end fund. So when we bought Suffolk Downs, we wanted an open-ended, usually a family is the right group. So our family is a US-based, high net worth family at Suffolk Downs. So the way the deal works is it's a 95% deal. So we have to find and put 5% of the capital in. That family puts 95% of the capital in. So the 5%, basically keeps us up at night, worried to death, because that's a heck of a lot of money for us. And they bring the 95% piece. And that's what allows us to go forward. And it's an open-ended fund. So it'll take us a long time, probably 15 years to build that out. So we need an open-ended fund to make that work.
Appreciate that. And then if you do smaller projects, do you typically just JV them and then, do the same 5%,
Yeah,
95
so the way
structure?
we'll do it is, the way we kind of divide up the world is we'll do GP capital or general partner capital, and then LP capital or limited partner capital. So the GP capital is kind of the highest risk piece. So if we're taking on a smaller project, that's typically like a family or somebody who sort of believes in us and has already done a project with us. So that'll be the initial equity to go into a project, to permit it, do the riskiest pieces of it, buy the land, permit the thing, get it set, designed, ready to go. And then when it's ready to go, literally when we're ready to build a building permit, then we'll usually raise then the LP capital. So that comes from a pension fund, and they get paid less basically. So it's less of a return for those folks, but it's a more predictable return. So like a housing project for those types of folks is kind of like a widget. You want to stamp that out. In the old days, before interest rates went up in the last year and a half, you could do a housing project at a 5.5% return on cost. So just think about that. It's just a straight 5.5% return on cost. Think about that in your lives. And that you could always find LP capital for that. So that was a pension fund or whatever those things. That market has kind of gone away, and it hasn't really come back yet, which is why it's so hard to build housing today, right now in 2024. It may get better in 25 if we can get the election behind us and we get, there was a first interest rate reduction by the Fed last week, so hopefully things get a little bit better. We'll see. Hopefully it gets better in 25.
So survive to 25.
Survive till 25. That's exactly it. That's our mantra right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tom, thank you for taking the evening to speak with us. As a founder, being a founder for a little more than 15 years, I'd love to hear about what personality traits and skill sets have helped you and other founders you observed kind of succeed in growing and scaling your business.
I'd say the key thing for me as a person has been to find the right balance to say, okay, here's the direction I think we should go in, while also kind of listening carefully to my partners and not being, an overbearing leader, right? So you have to find ways to be a good leader and set the direction while also compromising and listening carefully to other people. So, and there's no way to kind of set a rule except to be aware of that, and then to be prepared for individual, conversations. So as a company, for example, we're in the middle of conversations right now. So one of the things that's happening in Massachusetts, just as an example, is there's what's called the MBTA Communities Act. So Massachusetts, in an effort to try and get more housing built, has focused on communities that are served by the MBTA and is essentially telling those communities, if you're served by the MBTA, then you have to implement zoning that will allow for the construction of multifamily units of housing. Good business, but it's a very competitive, cutthroat, tough business. So if a site in which you can build 200 units comes up in Lexington, there's 20 different companies like us that go at it. And it's really hard. My partner loves that work because it's sort of how he came up in the business. So he loves to do those ka-chunk, ka-chunk, ka-chunk. But the way we built our business was on these relationships. So, the guy who owns Suffolk Downs, we went to see him, we took a risk, we bought it. The company, the railroad that owned NorthPoint, now Bulfinch Crossing, I knew those folks, we made that deal. The New Balance is owned by Jim Davis, who's a wonderful local guy, grew up here in Brookline. Knew him, so we made that deal. So these are what we call off-market deals. I think that's the heart of our company. So my belief is we should keep doing more of that kind of work and just keep trying to, but Doug really wants to do these other things. So every day I'm like, okay, well, let's go chase that. So we'll do some of that, we'll do some of that work. We haven't come up with one yet because they're competitive, but I keep feeding that and keep doing that. So you just, as a leader, you just have to sort of balance that out and say, we're going this direction, but by the way, I'll listen to you, we'll work on some of these things over here too. I think that's the best lesson to just be prepared for.
So I major in business analytics here, and I'm very new to the real estate world. This is actually my first class I've taken here in real estate, but I'm quite interested. So my question is just in your day-to-day with HYM, how do you use data and potentially AI and things in that realm?
So data is central to everything we do. So and our business is different than many other businesses that rely on data, because our data is really hard to pin down. So, for example, if you're in the equities business, okay, I recognize there's a ton of work that goes into this, but at the end of the day, you know what the stock price is of Amazon. Like you put your phone down, Amazon is priced at X, okay, and Amazon could tell you, here's what our sales were yesterday and that sort of thing. For us in the real estate business, if you want to build an office building, so we completed an office building, the new headquarters building for State Street Bank Corporation. So if you're coming into Boston out of the airport, and you come over the rise, before you go into the tunnel, slightly to the right, there's an elliptical building with a beautiful top to it, great design with the name State Street on the top of it. That's our building. We just completed that. That building cost $1 billion to build. So honestly, I was scared to death when we started that whole process, because you're like, holy mackerel, how are we going to do this? The first piece of that was to get one anchor tenant. So we got State Street to do that, but then to launch it, then we had to convince our capital, our investors, that we could find tenants at pricing that would make the underwriting work for us on that. And so to do that, we scoured the market. You had to know what every tenant was doing, where they were. Data is central to what we're doing in that regard, but it's really hard to pin it down, because there's different deals for different parts of the market, and they get done in different ways. So if you love data, but if you love the aspect of data that says, okay, yeah, this is broad-based data, but a lot of it is affected, a lot of pieces are affected by these individual circumstances of this building or this person or why they made that deal or whatever that is, that's what we do. And so data is absolutely central to what we do, really important. On the AI front, that's going to unbelievably affect our business, hopefully positively. Again, I said, when we go to design a new building, we start all over from scratch. So the architects, they go through the same kind of thing. And every time we build a building, the architect piece around the engineering, around the electrical and the piping and all that kind of stuff, they screw it up every time. So it always ends up being a change order, costs us more money. So AI is going to fix things like that. So I think our business is going to be a real center for that kind of work. So I don't want to influence you, but but come see us. I'll hook you up with folks, and they'll tell you what we do. So all good. Sorry, Neil.
So Tom, thanks for coming today. You're in a more of a unique position, given your positions in the past and the projects that you've seen, to peer into the future a little bit about Boston and the changing economic landscape for the future. What do you see? How do you see the downtown of Boston changing? And what are the market? I mean, we have life sciences, we've got academic, we've got tourism. Do you see any changes in the competitive marketplaces that are going to be serving the city in the future?
So I would say, Neil, great question. I'm worried a little bit. I think that the one thing I would say is, between Cambridge, meaning MIT, and then all the other institutions, including BC, I think we have solidified ourselves as the place that leads research around life science. I mean, I definitely think that we are that place today. And a lot of what drives that are the universities, but also the investment of National Institutes of Health funds. NIH funds come here in an extraordinary basis every year. So I think we're that place. But there are places like North Carolina that are trying to steal huge pieces of that business, the manufacturing of the product, of the life science research and all that. All those places are trying really hard to steal that business from us. And it is a competitive landscape. So for us, generally, I think we do need to be competitive. To be competitive, you have to really focus on our housing market. I mean, when you guys get out of school, you may want to stay here, but when you realize to be in a nice building, you got to pay $2,500 for a studio per month, you're going to say, holy mackerel, do I have to go to North Carolina, right? So what I'm nervous about is we're at a point, I don't think this is true in the state level, but I think in the city level, we're at a point where new political leaders are in place who don't have a memory of where we were. And we have been in some tough times as a city, largely because we didn't really think carefully about the future. We pushed too hard on taxes, on trying to create more affordable housing, trying to burden private sector folks. And I worry right now that in the city, the leadership is not understanding that we have to be really competitive. We have to try and make things happen. You can't sit back and wait for things to happen. You have to make things happen. You have to make this an attractive place for people to want to do business. And I do worry about that. That's a challenge for us.
Thanks.
Yep.
Thank you.